July 12th, 1944. 05:30 hours. Near Saint-Lô, France. The air is cool and damp, thick with the smell of wet earth and diesel fumes. Inside the turret of an M4A1 Sherman, Sergeant Frank Miller, 22 years old from Ohio, runs a greasy rag over the breech of the 75mm cannon. He moves with a deliberate slowness, a ritual to calm the tremor in his hands. Every metallic sound inside the steel hull is amplified, the clink of a wrench below, the soft hiss of the radio, the heavy breathing of his gunner, a kid from Brooklyn named Russo. Outside, the world is a wall of green. They call it the bocage. To Miller, it's just a maze designed by the devil. Each hedgerow, a 10-foot-high tangle of earth and ancient roots, is a perfect fortress, an ideal killing ground. Somewhere behind, one of those green walls, he knows the enemy is waiting. Not just infantry with their Panzerfausts, but something much worse. The whispers and rumors have hardened into fact in the minds of the tank crews. Panther, Tiger, names that carry the weight of death. Miller's fingers find the worn photograph tucked inside his helmet liner. It's a picture of his wife, smiling in the summer sun back home. He'd written to her last night by the dim light of a lantern, telling her not to worry. He'd told her about the French countryside, but not about the blackened, skeletal remains of other Shermans that lined the roads. He didn't tell her about the grim nickname the crews had given their own tanks, Ronsons, after the cigarette lighters, because they lit up on the first strike. From the command net, a voice crackles, distorted and tinny. All units, prepare to advance on Axis Blue. Move in 5 minutes. Miller looks through his periscope. The Sherman next to his, Davy Jones, belches a puff of blue smoke. Good men in that tank. They'd shared coffee an hour ago. Now, they were preparing to push into a labyrinth, where German anti-tank guns and heavy panzers held every advantage of range and cover. The American plan was simple, brutal, and costly. Push forward with overwhelming numbers. Use their lives as a currency to buy ground. He never heard the German generals laughing, but he felt it. He felt it in the way the enemy's 88mm shells could punch through his tank's frontal armor from a kilometer away, while his own 75mm rounds bounced harmlessly off the thick, sloped hide of a Panther. The laughter was in the disparity of the machines, but the high command had a different kind of math, a cold, industrial logic that men like Miller couldn't afford to think about. Not now. The engine roars to life, the entire 30-ton vehicle vibrating around him. It feels powerful, it feels strong, but Miller knows it's a fragile steel shell. The advance is about to begin, and the green maze is waiting to swallow them whole. The battlefield of 1944 was a theater of profound technological and philosophical clashes, nowhere more evident than in the armored warfare of the Western Front. At the heart of this conflict were two opposing doctrines, embodied by their premier fighting vehicles. For the German Wehrmacht, the tank was the apotheosis of battlefield dominance, a fusion of superior firepower, impenetrable armor, and technological perfection. This philosophy culminated in two of the most formidable fighting machines of the war, the Panzer V, the Panther, and the Panzer VI, the Tiger. The Panther, weighing in at 45 tons, was a marvel of engineering. Its main armament, the 7.5mm Caballero 42 L70 gun, was a high-velocity cannon capable of destroying any Allied tank from ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Its armor was thick and brilliantly sloped, particularly the 80mm frontal glacis plate, angled at 55 degrees to provide an effective thickness of over 140 millimeters, rendering it virtually immune to the American Sherman's standard cannon. Then, there was the Tiger Y, a 57-ton behemoth. Its very presence on the battlefield was a psychological weapon. Its armor was a slab-sided wall of steel, 100mm thick at the front. Its weapon was the legendary 8.8cm KWK-36 L56 gun, an adaptation of the world's most feared anti-aircraft cannon. The 88 fired a heavy projectile at blistering velocity, capable of punching through a Sherman tank from front to back. These machines were precision instruments of death, designed for a doctrine of qualitative superiority. A single, Tiger or Panther, crewed by veterans and placed in a defensive, hull-down position, could hold off an entire company of enemy tanks, picking them off one by one with impunity. But this power came at a staggering cost. The Panther and Tiger were complex, over-engineered, and mechanically temperamental. They consumed enormous amounts of fuel, a resource Germany was desperately short of. Their production was a painstaking, resource-intensive process. In total, Germany would produce fewer than 6,000 Panthers and only around 1,350 Tiger I tanks throughout the entire war. They were knights in shining armor, magnificent but few. Across the lines stood the American M4 Sherman. On paper, it was a study in compromise. Weighing a more modest 30 to 38 tons depending on the variant, its armor was comparatively thin and mostly vertical, a design flaw that made it a welcoming target. Its main weapon for most of the war was the 75mm M3 gun, a decent multi-purpose weapon effective against infantry and fortifications, but woefully inadequate against the frontal armor of the late-war German heavy panzers. Its high profile made it an easy silhouette to spot, and its gasoline engine and ammunition storage gave it a notorious reputation for bursting into flames when penetrated, a vulnerability that gave rise to its grim British nickname, the Tommy Cooker. German tank aces and generals, products of a military culture that prized technological supremacy, looked at the specifications of the Sherman and saw a deeply inferior machine. They considered it a product of a commercial, consumerist society, a cheap, mass-produced tool for a brute force army, not a proper weapon for the connoisseur of war. But they missed the point entirely. The Sherman was not designed to be the best tank in the world. It was designed to be the tank that could win the war. Its design philosophy was not born in the halls of a Prussian military academy, but on the assembly lines of Detroit. The Ford V8 engine, and later the Wright Continental radial engine, were masterpieces of reliability. Where a Panther might break down after 150 kilometers, a Sherman could travel 2 or 3 times that distance without major overhaul. Its parts were standardized and easily replaced. Its turret traverse was fast, powered by a hydraulic system that was quicker than the German manual or electric hydraulic systems. Crucially, its main gun was fitted with a gyroscopic stabilizer, allowing the gunner to keep the cannon laid on a target even while the tank was moving over rough terrain, a stunning technological advantage that German panzers lacked. And above all, there was the sheer, overwhelming power of American industry. While German factories, hammered by Allied bombing, struggled to produce a few dozen heavy tanks a month, the American arsenal of democracy was churning out Shermans at a staggering rate. The Detroit tank arsenal alone could produce more tanks in a few months than Germany could in a year. By the end of the war, nearly 50,000 Sherman tanks of all variants had been built. The German strategy was to build an unbreakable sword. The American strategy was to build a tidal wave. The Germans saw a one-on-one duel between a Panther and a Sherman. The Americans saw a strategic equation where 5 Shermans were a resource they could afford to expend to kill 1 Panther, which was a resource the Germans could not. It was this fundamental industrial mismatch that would define the armored conflict in the West. The Germans had brought masterpieces to the fight. The Americans had brought the assembly line itself. For the American tanker, the war was not fought with production statistics or strategic doctrines. It was fought from the cramped claustrophobic confines of their M4 Sherman. Life inside was a sensory assault. The air was a cocktail of odors, the acrid smell of cordite after a shell was fired, the hot sting of gun oil, the ever-present reek of diesel or gasoline, and the sweat of 5 men living in constant heart-pounding proximity. Every crewman had their domain. The driver, sitting low in the front, wrestled with levers, peering through a narrow vision slit that offered a terrifyingly limited view of the world. Beside him, the bowgunner manned a .30 caliber machine gun, a weapon more for morale than for any real tactical effect against armor. In the turret, the loader, gunner, and commander worked in a tight, violent ballet. The loader, often the strongest, had to heave 15-pound shells into the breech in seconds, avoiding the recoiling brass as it ejected, hot enough to brand skin. The gunner sat hunched over his periscope sight, his world reduced to a crosshair, his job to find and kill before being killed. And above them all, the commander. He was the eyes and ears of the tank, often fighting with his head and shoulders exposed from the hatch to get a precious 360-degree view of the battlefield, a position that made him terrifyingly vulnerable to snipers and shell fragments. He had to process a chaotic flood of information: the terrain ahead, the garbled chatter on the radio, the location of his platoon mates, the shouted reports from his crew, and the constant, gnawing search for the hidden threat. Fear was a permanent crew member. It was the fear of the unseen anti-tank gun, the crack thump of a shell hitting the hull, a sound that tankers described as a giant sledgehammer striking steel right next to your ear. It was the fear of the Panzerfaust, the German infantryman's disposable rocket launcher that could turn their tank into an inferno from the shadows of a ruined building. But most of all, it was the fear of the German panzers. Every crewman knew the math. They knew their 75mm gun was called a pea-shooter against the frontal armor of a Panther. They had been drilled relentlessly on the only tactics that gave them a chance: speed and numbers. They were not to engage a Panther or Tiger head-on. That was suicide. The doctrine was to use their superior numbers to fix the enemy from the front, while other Shermans used their agility to race for a flanking shot. Get him from the side or hit him in the ass was the mantra. They had to get within 500 yards to have a prayer of penetrating the weaker side armor of a Panther. The Panther, meanwhile, could kill them from well over a mile away. To mitigate their tank's vulnerabilities, the crews improvised. They welded spare track links to the hull and turret for extra protection. They piled sandbags on the glossy's plate, a practice of questionable effectiveness that nonetheless provided a psychological comfort. They tried to pack the ammunition racks in wet casings to reduce the chance of a catastrophic fire. They learned to use the landscape, to hug hedgerows, to use the reverse slope of a hill for cover, popping up only to fire before quickly reversing back into safety. The bond between a crew was absolute. They were 5 men who depended on each other for their very survival. They knew each other's hometowns, the names of their sweethearts, their fears, and their dreams. This small 5-man family was their entire world, a fragile bubble of humanity inside a 30-ton machine of war. They knew that a single mistake, a moment of hesitation, could mean a fiery death for all of them. This shared fate forged an unbreakable trust, but it also carried an unbearable weight. Every morning, as they prepared their tank for battle, checking the engine, loading the ammunition, cleaning the guns, they would look at each other, an unspoken understanding passing between them. They were heading into a fight where their machine was outclassed. Their tactics were desperate, and their survival depended on skill, luck, and the hope that today there would be more of them than there were of the enemy. From the cupola of his Panzer V Panther, Oberleutnant Klaus Richter surveys the Norman landscape through his state-of-the-art Zeiss TZF-12A optics. The magnification is so clear, so powerful, that he can count the leaves on the trees 1,500 meters away. For Richter, a veteran of the Eastern Front, this new battlefield is a strange one. The Americans are not like the Soviets. They are less fanatical, more cautious, but they possess a material wealth that is simply bewildering. He feels a supreme confidence in his machine. The Panther is, in his estimation, the finest medium tank in the world. Its sloped armor has shed countless Soviet shells. Its long 75mm cannon is a surgeon's scalpel, precise and deadly at ranges the Americans can only dream of. He has listened to the intelligence reports. The primary American tank, the Sherman, is a design from 1941. It is tall, thinly armored, and undergunned. His gunner, a hawk-eyed youth named Helmut, calls them Blechbüchsen, tin cans. Richter's expectation for the coming engagement is clear and founded on experience. He anticipates the Americans will advance in predictable formations, relying on rigid, by-the-book tactics. He expects them to blunder into his kill zone one after another. His doctrine is one of ambush and long-range attrition. He will find a concealed hull-down position, with a clear field of fire. He will let the Shermans come to him. His first shot will be decisive, aimed at the lead tank to block the path of the others and sow confusion. He expects 1 shot, 1 kill. Then he will calmly traverse his turret, select his next target, and repeat the process. He has a deep-seated contempt for the Sherman, not just as a machine, but as a symbol. It represents the American way of war. Impersonal, industrial, and lacking in the warrior spirit he believes defines a true Panzersoldat. He and his crew are masters of their craft, a finely honed weapon system. The American tankers, he believes, are simply factory workers in uniform, sent to overwhelm through sheer, clumsy mass. His greatest concerns are not the American tanks, but their terrifying artillery and the ever-present threat of their fighter bombers, the dreaded Jabos. He has seen what a P-47 Thunderbolt can do to a panzer column. Therefore, his strategy is one of patience. He will remain hidden, silent until the moment of maximum advantage. He anticipates a battle of quality against quantity, a test of his crew's superior skill and his tank's technological supremacy against the American deluge. He expects to destroy 5, perhaps 6, Shermans before his position is compromised. Then, he will use his Panther's surprising speed to withdraw, reposition, and begin the process again. He is a predator, a shark in a sea of minnows. He does not fear the Sherman. He does not respect it. He simply expects to kill it, efficiently and professionally. The only unknown is how many will be sent against him. But for Richter, this is merely a question of ammunition expenditure. The outcome of the duel, he believes, is already a certainty. Late September 1944, the Lorraine region of France. The rapid Allied advance following the breakout from Normandy has begun to slow as German resistance stiffens. Here, near the town of Ericourt, one of the largest and most telling tank battles of the Western Front is about to erupt. An engagement that will shatter German expectations. The German 5th Panzer Army, equipped with brand new Panther tanks, many straight from the factory, launches a major counter-offensive. Their objective is to cut off and destroy the exposed spearhead of General Patton's 3rd Army, specifically the U.S. 4th Armored Division. The German commanders are confident. Their Panthers vastly outmatch the Shermans of the 4th Armored in both armor and firepower. On the morning of September 19th, under the cover of a thick rolling fog, the German panzer columns begin their advance. Oberleutnant Richter's Panther is part of the spearhead. The fog is a double-edged sword. It conceals their approach, but it also blinds his superior long-range optics. The battle he expects to fight at 2,500 meters will now be fought at 500, or even closer. The men of Combat Command A, 4th Armored Division, are on alert, but they are not expecting a full-scale assault. A platoon of M4 Shermans from the 37th Tank Battalion is positioned near the village of Rechicourt. Suddenly, out of the swirling mist, the monstrous silhouettes of Panthers emerge. There is no time for elegant maneuvers. It is a brawl at point-blank range. Richter's gunner, Helmet, spots a Sherman traversing its turret. Target 11 o'clock! The Panther's long cannon barks and a fireball engulfs the American tank. A kill, just as expected. But before they can acquire a second target, chaos erupts. This is not a clean, clinical duel. The American response is instantaneous and violent. Instead of panicking, the remaining Shermans react with drilled precision. One tank fires a white phosphorus shell that bursts against Richter's Panther. It does no damage to the armor, but thick, choking smoke pours across his vision ports, blinding him. Another Sherman, hidden behind a small rise, fires a 75mm high-explosive shell at his tracks, attempting to immobilize him. Simultaneously, the American commander is screaming into his radio, and the American system of war responds. Within minutes, the sky begins to tear apart. The dreaded sound of incoming artillery. A barrage of 105mm shells from M7 Priest's self-propelled guns crashes down around the German formation. The shells are not aimed at individual tanks, but at the entire area, designed to shatter formations, suppress infantry, and create a hellscape of noise and shrapnel. Through a gap in the smoke, Richter sees something he does not expect. A Sherman is not charging him head-on, but racing at full speed parallel to his position, using its mobility not to attack, but to get to the flank of another Panther in his company. The Sherman is firing on the move, its gyro-stabilized gun keeping the barrel steady, spitting 75mm rounds that clang harmlessly off the frontal armor, but keep the German crew distracted, their heads down. Then the sky clears for a moment. The fog lifts, and the true nature of the American swarm is revealed. It isn't just a handful of tanks. It's an entire system. P-47 Thunderbolts, directed by a forward air controller on the ground, now scream down from the clouds. Their 50-caliber machine guns, 8 to a plane, stitch lines across the fields, chewing up the vulnerable supply trucks and supporting infantry that were following the Panzers. They fire high-velocity aircraft rockets that can cripple a Panther. Richter's Panther is now isolated. His supporting infantry are pinned down. The artillery is raining down. And from 3 different directions, Shermans are maneuvering, communicating, coordinating. They are not acting as individual dueling knights, but as a pack of wolves. A shell from an unseen M10 tank destroyer, armed with a better 3-inch gun, slams into the side of his turret. The shell penetrates. The inside of the Panther becomes a maelstrom of spalling steel. His gunner slumps over dead. The radio is gone, The Battle of Aracourt rages for days. It is a meat grinder. The Germans, with their superior tanks, expect to annihilate the Americans, but they are systematically dismantled. The Americans use their radios, their artillery, their air power, and the surprising agility of their Shermans in a symphony of combined arms. They refuse to fight the battle the Germans want. They don't fight tank versus tank. They fight their entire military system versus a German tank. The results of the Battle of Aracourt were, for the German High Command, utterly incomprehensible. Over several days of fighting, the German 5th Panzer Army lost over 86 tanks, including at least 40 of their prized Panthers. A further 100 armored vehicles were damaged or destroyed. In return, they had managed to knock out just 25 American tanks. The masters of armored warfare, in their superior machines, had been dealt a stunning and humiliating defeat. The unexpected outcome was not a fluke. It was the result of a strategic reality that the German generals had fundamentally misunderstood. Their laughter had been based on a flawed premise, that the war would be decided by individual vehicle quality. Aracourt proved them wrong. The first surprise was the tactical flexibility of the American units. Expecting a rigid, road-bound advance, the Germans were instead met by an enemy that used terrain, speed, and fluid coordination to devastating effect. The American tankers, knowing they were outgunned, had developed a doctrine that compensated for their vehicles' weaknesses. They were aggressive but not stupid. They communicated constantly via radio, allowing a platoon or company to react as a single organism, flanking, suppressing, and overwhelming isolated German panzers. The Sherman's fast turret traverse and stabilized gun were not decisive advantages on their own. But in the close quarters, chaotic brawls of the French countryside, they allowed American crews to get shots off faster and more accurately while on the move, a critical edge when seconds meant life or death. The second and more profound shock was the devastating effectiveness of American combined arms. The Panther was designed to kill tanks, but it was surprisingly vulnerable to the ecosystem of war that surrounded the Sherman. American armored divisions were not just tank formations. They were self-contained mobile armies. Every tank battalion had its own organic artillery support in the form of M7 priests. They had their own infantry and M3 half-tracks to protect against ambushes. They had their own reconnaissance units. And most importantly, they had a direct line to the U.S. Army Air Forces. The P-47 Thunderbolt was arguably as effective a tank killer as any anti-tank gun, not just through direct attack, but by annihilating the supply lines that the fuel-hungry German panzers depended on. A Panther without fuel is just a 45-ton pillbox. A Tiger that throws a track without a recovery vehicle is just a monument to wasted industrial effort. This was the core of the American swarm. It was not merely a swarm of tanks. It was a swarm of logistics, of artillery shells, of fighter bombers, of spare parts, and of fresh replacement vehicles. When a Sherman was knocked out at Aracourt, a new one, fresh from the Red Ball Express supply route, could often be at the front within 24 hours. When a Panther was knocked out, it was often gone for good. Germany simply did not have the resources, the fuel, or the industrial capacity to replace its losses. The German generals had built a force of expert duelists. The Americans had built a war-winning machine. The Germans could win the battle, but the Americans were winning the war of attrition. Every Panther lost was an irreplaceable asset, crewed by an expert who was increasingly hard to replace. Every Sherman lost was a regrettable but statistically acceptable cost of doing business. The unexpected outcome was that the German army was being bled white, not by a superior tank, but by a superior system of war that rendered the individual quality of their tanks tragically irrelevant. The psychological impact of this new reality rippled through the German panzer forces with devastating speed. The initial arrogance and confidence born of technological superiority began to curdle into a grim, weary fatalism. The laughter died, replaced by a gnawing anxiety. For the German panzer crew, the battlefield was transformed. It was no longer a hunting ground where they held all the advantages. It became an arena of constant, unrelenting pressure. They started the day with a limited supply of fuel and a handful of armor-piercing shells. They knew that no replacements were coming. Every decision was freighted with existential weight. Do they engage that distant column of Shermans and reveal their position to the ever-present Jabo fighter bombers? Do they risk moving and breaking down, far from any hope of repair? The crews, once convinced of their invincibility, now felt a creeping vulnerability. The endless sea of Shermans was demoralizing. They could destroy 3, 4, even 5 of them, but there were always more. The American tanks just kept coming, pushing forward over the burning wrecks of their comrades. This relentless pressure bred a unique kind of exhaustion, a combat fatigue born not just from the fear of death, but from the sheer hopelessness of their strategic situation. They were elite warriors trapped in a failing system, witnessing the slow, grinding destruction of their entire army. The myth of the superweapon was broken. A Tiger commander might feel secure behind his 100mm of steel, but that security vanished when the artillery spotter plane began circling overhead. A Panther crew might have the finest gun and optics, but that advantage meant nothing when they were blind in thick fog or thick smoke, being stalked from multiple angles by faster, more nimble opponents. The war was no longer about the purity of the tank-on-tank duel. It was messy, chaotic, and industrial, and it was a form of war they were not equipped to win. Conversely, for the American tankers, a profound psychological shift occurred. The terror was still there. No Sherman crewman ever lost his respect for the killing power of an 88mm gun, but the feeling of being helpless prey was replaced by a grim, workmanlike confidence. They had found a way to win. Their doctrine worked. They were not duelists. They were pack hunters, and their strength was in their numbers and their teamwork. Seeing a mighty panther burning on the side of the road, brought down by their coordinated efforts, was a more powerful morale booster than any speech from a general. It validated their training, their courage, and their trust in the system they were a part of. They understood their role. They were the tip of a very long spear, a spear forged in the factories of Detroit and supplied by an unbroken chain stretching back across the Atlantic. They knew they were expendable, but they also knew they were part of an overwhelming, irresistible force. This growing confidence allowed them to take calculated risks, to be aggressive, to push the advance. They fought with the knowledge that if their tank was knocked out, another would take its place. If they fell, another crew would carry on. They were the interchangeable, resilient, and ultimately victorious cogs in a vast machine that was slowly, inexorably, grinding the German war effort into dust. The German soldier fought for victory. By late 1944, the American tanker fought for the inevitable conclusion. When the guns fell silent in Europe in May 1945, the landscape was littered with the metal carcasses of the Third Reich's armored might. The final verdict on the M4 Sherman was not written in the memoirs of German generals who had once scoffed at its design, but in the simple, undeniable fact of victory. The Sherman tank was, without question, flawed. It was undergunned and under-armored for the battlefields of 1944. Thousands of American tankers paid the ultimate price for those flaws. Later variants, like the M4A3E8 Easy 8, with its improved suspension and more powerful 76mm gun, and the British Firefly modification with its fearsome 17-pounder cannon, were significant improvements that began to level the playing field. But even these upgunned models were not a match for a King Tiger. However, to judge the Sherman on its one-on-one combat capability is to fundamentally miss the point of its existence and its role in Allied strategy. It was a vehicle that perfectly embodied the American doctrine of war, a doctrine built on mobility, reliability, logistics, and overwhelming industrial production. The war was not won by the single best tank, but by the best system of war. The Sherman was the mobile, adaptable, and ever-present heart of that system. It was the Sherman that spearheaded Patton's lightning dash across France. Its mechanical reliability allowed divisions to maintain an operational tempo that the complex, breakdown-prone German panzers could never hope to match. It was the Sherman that held the line, and then spearheaded the counterattack during the Battle of the Bulge, its mobility on icy roads and its sheer numbers proving decisive against the lumbering German heavy tanks who literally ran out of gas. The strategic legacy of the M4 Sherman is that of a good enough weapon that, when integrated into a brilliant logistical and combined arms framework, becomes a war winner. It demonstrated that in a protracted industrial war, quantity has a quality all its own. The German focus on creating a handful of exquisite, technologically perfect weapons proved to be a strategic dead end. They built tanks to win a battle. The United States built an army to win a war. The German generals who laughed at the Sherman in 1942 and 1943 were looking at a blueprint. They saw a collection of statistics on armor thickness and gun caliber. What they failed to see was the industrial titan behind it, the logistical genius that supplied it, and the flexible doctrine that wielded it. They laughed at the individual tank, but they were ultimately crushed by the swarm, a swarm of steel, of shells, of supplies, and of determined soldiers. The M4 Sherman was the humble, Workhorse embodiment of a power that was less glamorous than the Tiger, but infinitely more decisive. It was the tank that got the job done.